and the Republican Cause in the United States, 1936 to 1977. My name is Chris Vials. I'm a professor of English here at UConn and also director of the American Studies program. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the territory of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Scoticoke, Golden Hill, Paugussett, Nipmuc, and Lenape peoples who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. Thank you also to the UConn Department of History for sponsoring this great event, specifically Victor Zatsapin and Meredith Friedman. And I'm going to introduce each of our panelists just very briefly and then have them cut right into their presentations. Each of them have PowerPoints. One thing I'll just stress just about the structure is that each of them will be talking for around 10 to 15 minutes each, and then we will, after that, cut to Q&A, and I'll be moderating the Q&A mostly through the Stack. I'll just ask you to write Stack in the chat window, and also on that note, we'll be running to at the very latest 1:30, and we're also recording this event as well, just so you know too. So for our three panelists here, so Dr. Ariel Lambe is Assistant Professor of History at UConn and author of No Barrier Can Contain It, Cuban Anti-Fascism in the Spanish Civil War with UIPress in 2019. Dr. Cristina Pérez Jiménez is Assistant Professor of English at Manhattan College, co-editor of Guillermo Cotto-Thorner's Manhattan Tropics, Trópico in Manhattan, Arte, Público, 2019. And finally, Dr.Montse, Associate Professor of Spanish at Sam Houston State University and author of Fighting Fascist Spain, Worker Protest from the Printing Press, University of Illinois Press in 2020. So with all of that said, and without further ado, we will start in the order that the flyer has it listed. So we'll start with Ariel.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to Chris for moderating today, to my co-panelists for being here, and also to Victor and Meredith from the History Department for their vital assistance in making this event happen. I am going to share my screen. I don't have much of a PowerPoint. I just wanted to let you know what we were talking about, to have a vision of what we were talking about as I spoke today. So this is the title of my talk today, Cuban Anti-Fascism in New York City. And the image here is the cover of my book. But the reason that I put that up is mostly to show you the wonderful painting there, which is a artistic representation of the Club Cubano Julio Antonio Mella, which is an important site of Cuban anti-fascism and indeed Latinx anti-fascism in New York City during the Spanish Civil War. So I have that image up for you to enjoy. It's such a vibrant painting and a great view into anti-fascism in New York at this time. If I'll draw your attention, if you can see, I don't know how big the image is on your screen, but directly above the trio in the foreground is a poster, a very famous Spanish Civil War poster on the back wall there. So there's a little bit of Spain present in the image as well. So I'm going to talk briefly today about three Cubans who lived in New York City prior to the Spanish Civil War and who subsequently got involved in the Republican cause. They are Basilio Cuellar Obret, who went on to serve as an officer in Spain, Dr. Eduardo Odio Pérez, who went on to serve as a doctor in Spain, and Tete Castuso, who returned to Cuba and founded the organization at the head of the Cuban campaign to aid Spanish children impacted by the conflict. I focus on these three figures to hint at the diversity of Cuban anti-fascism and also to emphasize the important role that New York City played in its development. Basilio Cuellar Obret, who was born in Marianao, Cuba in June 1898, was biracial. His father was from Asturias in Spain and his mother was Black. He received a primary education, served for 3 years in the Cuban military, and then migrated to the United States in 1920. A laborer and a baseball player in the US Negro Leagues, he noted never having been a union member, and it appears that he was politicized in New York City's anti-fascist milieu. In a volunteer questionnaire completed in Spain, he dated his politicization to the year 1930 and attributed it to, quote, the movement of New York. He joined the US Communist Party in February 1931 as part of a cell which he called, quote, cell number 108 of the Barrio Latino. He cited African-American communist leader James W. Ford as his principal contact in the party. When asked what sorts of political actions he had participated in, he responded, quote, anti-fascist strikes and demonstrations. He also became a member of the Club Cubano Julio Antonio Mella in New York City, and it is likely that it was there that he volunteered to travel to Spain. He arrived in Spain in January 1937, and at a later date stated as his reason for the trip, quote, to fight against fascism. See, sorry, I thought I had a slideshow here. There we go. I couldn't change the image. There's Basilio for us to look at while I talk about him. Quercia received attention from some important political and cultural figures for his efforts in Spain. Both Cuban writer Nicolás Guillén and US writer Langston Hughes profiled the baseball player turned military officer. Both authors addressed Quercia's identity as a Cuban of African descent and as an anti-fascist. Hughes portrayed Quercia's assessment of the fascism he was fighting in Spain in racial terms, quoting the Cuban as saying, we can't let fascists put it over on us. They'd put all the worst old prejudices back into force and probably even introduce new ones, like Hitler and his Aryanism in Germany, close quote. Seizing upon Quercia's biracial identity, Guillén asserted that Quercia's desire to fight fascism derived from his lineage on both sides. From Asturias, quote, the fierce impetus, the hard resilience, the unbroken tenacity. And from Africa, quote, the tempest of the spirit that crushed slavery, and that finally explodes in search of a revolutionary way for its ascent. Quercia's piel mestiza, or mixed skin, for Guillén represented anti-fascist solidarity as, quote, a symbol of union before an enemy common to the workers of all races. Somewhat less theoretical and more practical, African-American communist leader Ford commented, quote, long before leaving for Spain, Basilio Quercia was a potential grenade launcher. Remembering seeing him play baseball, Ford stated that he, quote, put the ball where he wanted. It was for this reason, this accuracy of throwing, that Quercia had, quote, been promoted for his heroic actions as a grenade launcher. In Spain, Ford asserted, concluding that Quercia had, quote, put his craft with all his heart in the service of the Spanish people and of world democracy.
Really loud.
Ford also commented on Dr. Eduardo Odio Pérez, praising the doctor's intelligence and dedication to the independence of Cuba. It made a good impression on him, he stated, quote, finding such a loyal representative of the Cuban intelligentsia, caring for wounded Americans and Cubans on the Spanish front. The white Cuban doctor was born in Santiago de Cuba in 1893, and like many Cubans of his era, lived a transnational life starting at an early age. He attended primary school in Santiago de Cuba and secondary school in Far Rockaway, New York, then pursued medical training at the University of Havana, at Loyola University, and at Chicago Memorial Hospital, earning an MD. He served as head of sanitation for the Havana Health Department during the early 1930s and was politicized beginning in 1927 by the anti-dictatorial struggle in Cuba. He became a member of the Central Committee of the country's Agrarian Party, the PAN, and in this capacity, he was forced to flee into exile repeatedly, both in Central America and the United States. With a wife and 3 children, Dr. Odio Pérez found himself in exile again in 1935 in New York City. During his time there, the doctor became a member of the Club Maya and gave speeches addressing Cuban politics. Immersed in the networks of Cuban political exile, he attended the Madison Square Garden reception for Spanish Republican Ambassador Fernando de los Rios, which took place in January 1937. It was there that he struck upon the idea to travel to Spain as a medical volunteer, a decision which he attributed to both humanitarian reasons and political awareness. Asked by a biographical survey what his motives were for going to Spain, he responded, quote, "We could not do much in Cuba or in USA." This comment is indicative of a common sentiment among many Cuban anti-fascists, that the Spanish fight was a stand-in for the Cuban one, so long as the Cuban one was frustrated. Additionally, the doctor noted that he was in a terrible economic situation at the time, trying to support his wife and children, indicating that he may have received payment or some other form of support for his service in Spain. Perhaps the cost of living in New York City also played a small role in propelling Cubans there into anti-fascist activity. For every Cuban anti-fascist who served the Republic in Spain, there were many, many more who waged the struggle against fascism without crossing the Atlantic. Tete Castuso was born in 1912 in Madruga to an economically insecure family of Cuba's landed elite and was college educated. She became a leader in Cuban anti-fascism on the island after her husband, Pablo de la Torriente Brau, was killed fighting for the Republic in Spain. Husband and wife had been together in political exile in New York City in 1935 and 1936, following their participation in the anti-strongman struggles on the island. When he left New York for Spain shortly after the start of the Civil War, their agreement was that she would follow. Once she had arrived, however, and despite the fact that they had fought side by side for years, he told her that the conflict in Spain was no place for her, and she should return to the island to stay with her parents. She obeyed. If that strikes you as highly gendered, you will be interested to know that Castuso went on to channel her organizing energy into leading the Cuban campaign to aid Spanish Republican children. In her poetry, she linked this effort directly to her own loss of an opportunity to have children due to her husband's death. "My lullaby has no child," she wrote. "For the earth and for the children, my love has come to sing." The association Castuso founded grew, she claimed, to 300,000 members, with delegations in every town on the island. It performed not only tremendous fundraising, but also 2 successful clothing drives for which Cuban women and girls sewed, and the establishment of the Casa Escuela Pueblo de Cuba, a boarding school for children impacted by the war in the Catalan town of Sitges, led by Black Cuban educator Rosa Pastora Leclerc. Despite continually claiming to be a nonpartisan aid organization, Castuso's association was deeply and strongly anti-fascist, as both its bulletin and its organizational records show. Castuso meant it in part to be an homage to her late husband and his anti-fascist struggle. I have briefly presented these 3 figures to hint at the diversity of Cuban anti-fascism and to emphasize the importance of New York City in the development of this movement. In each of the 3 different cases, the US city and the transnational political organizing currents and spaces there played a critical role in propelling these Cubans into anti-fascism. I would love to explore these themes more in the Q&A. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Ariel. So next we have Dr. Cristina Pérez Jiménez.
Here, I Thank you, Shir. Hi, everyone. I want to thank so much Dr. Lambe for having me, Dr. Vials for serving as a moderator and respondent. I'm just really delighted to be in conversation here. And the talk I've sort of prepared is titled One Voice for Spain, La Voz, the Spanish Republican Cause and Hispanic Unity in New York. And I should start by saying that it's very well known that the foundations of Latino New York hark back to the 19th century, right? To this moment when Cuban exiles and revolutionaries from Puerto Rico, from Cuba, came together, right, to fight for independence of their homelands, fighting against Spanish imperialism from abroad, right, from the center of New York City. Shared anti-colonial sentiments brought together Cubans, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans in New York, and Spain served as a common enemy. And to me, this history has grounded a kind of foundational opposition between Old World Spain and the New World Latin, between the former empire and the Latino revolutionary subject, between Spain and Lo Latino. Yet this account has obscured other entangled histories and relations of accord, of different meanings or bearings of Spain in the making of Latino New York. As Carrie Nelson puts it in a different context, there are many Spains we remember, many we have forgotten. Some of them overlap, and some of them seem to have no point of correspondence. And this what I'm presenting as part of a book, a book chapter, which is part of my larger book project or book manuscript, which explores the construction of Latino New York, the construction of a cultural imaginary, a Latinx cultural imaginary in the context of the embattled decades of the 1930s and 40s. So in the context of the rise of workers' movements, the rise of civil rights movements, the rise of anti-fascism and popular front activisms, the rise of the so-called new Pan-Americanism and so forth, how this sort of sociopolitical conjuncture incited Spanish-speaking New Yorkers to mobilize in tandem as part of a collective, unified, permanent ethnic minority that was here to stay right in New York. And in this chapter in particular, I'm hoping to help recover and reinsert the importance of the Spanish Civil War in the making of Latino New York. And to do so is really to sort of trace the invisible shift that Spain underwent, almost as a signifier, from something that was divisive to something that was unifying for Spanish-speaking New Yorkers. And in terms of a little bit of context, I think it's important to underline that after the collapse of the Spanish Empire in 1898, the US solidified its own imperial ambitions and consolidated its economic and political control of the Spanish Caribbean basin. By the 1930s, it was US military control, crushing economic policies and complicity with local dictatorships and colonial governments in the region that steered Spanish-speaking activists in New York, right? So the symbol of empire was no longer Spain, but had become the United States. As my work underscores, the political balance of Spain didn't recede, but was resignified. It is against a context of US hegemony that Spain, as if shedding the last vestiges of its conservative imperial past, declares itself a republic in 1931 and undergoes, in the eyes of many Spanish-speaking New Yorkers, a remarkable and radical redefinition. So Spain was no longer a symbol of an old decadent empire, but a newly triumphant republic in the midst of a veritable vexed social revolution. To sympathetic eyes, Spain had vanquished a dictatorship, abolished a monarchy, stripped the Roman Catholic Church of its powers. It ratified a new constitution that guaranteed broad civil liberties and progressive economic reforms, all under a new national flag that evoked the political promises of the French Revolution. And I understand this fairly well-known context because I think it's something that's been missing from Latinx studies accounts, right, of Spain and the relationship between Latinidad and Spain, right? It's important to remember that from the vantage point of left-leaning Hispanic New Yorkers, the Spain of 1931 was not a repository of cultural heritage, but more the manifestation of progressive political possibilities. It was less a reminder of a gilded imperial past and more the heralded beacon of a just and egalitarian future. And again, in Latino studies, when we think about Spain, we tend to think about heritage, about kind of an imperial nostalgia, about a past. And if we situate ourselves from the vantage point of Hispanic New Yorkers in the 1930s, Spain was really a country of revolution, of the promises of a progressive and more egalitarian future. And as you know, Dr. Lambe had just presented, I think it's also important to understand that Spain, for so many Hispanic New Yorkers, Cubans, but also Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, Spain really represented, was not a faraway foreign conflict, but really represented a kind of expression of their own yearnings for justice, for equality, for autonomy. It really served as Dr. Lambe's work shows as a proxy for their own fight for democracy and freedom. In the words of New York Puerto Rican socialist writer Bernardo Vega, the cause of Republican Spain became our own. Or as former New York State Communist Party chairman George Charmy recalled, Spanish Harlem was, quote, in ferment. Politics embraced the entire family, from the youngest to the oldest. The women were as activist and embroiled as the men. I never knew a community, a people so passionately involved in the Spanish Civil War. It was their cause. No group could cry out the slogan, no pasarán, as they could, or contribute as much as they did in dimes, quarters, and dollars. And in fact, as Eric Smith has noted, New York Hispanic communities raised nearly a quarter of the total relief sent from the US to the Spanish Republic. And this is a really staggering figure, a surprising figure, because these were poor working class communities, right? That were literally giving their all and coming together to raise these enormous amounts of money. So mobilizing as a pan-ethnic community together with political cohesion and common purpose, the cause of Republican Spain, I argued, functioned as a collective rallying cry among diverse Spanish-speaking New Yorkers, which helped forge lasting Latino alliances. And it's important to remember at this time, Spaniards tended to identify and mobilize along regional lines. So you had Galicians and you had people from the Basque Country and Catalans and so forth. And people from the Spanish Caribbean retain, right, their national identity, Cubans, Puerto Ricans. And in the context of the Spanish Civil War, there's a kind of context for them to come together as part of a common and united, quote unquote, Hispanic, right, anti-fascist front. So if in the late 19th century, Spanish-speaking exiles had gathered in New York to fight against an imperial Spain, 3 decades later, Spanish speakers once again came together in the city, but now in support of an anti-fascist Republican Spain, which embodied so many of their progressive political aspirations right at home. And this oft-overlooked resignification of Spain and Latino New York is well evidenced in the New York Spanish language daily La Voz, which came out first in 1937. Significantly, although Spain was at the ideological forefront of La Voz, Harlem's Latino barrio was at its symbolic center. Despite the fact that La Voz was owned and published by a Spaniard, was focused, its reason for existing was the Spanish cause, was headquartered in Greenwich Street, right in the heart of Little Spain. The paper's intended audience was not Spanish exiles or even New York Spanish migrant communities, but the poor and working class Latinos of overwhelmingly Spanish Caribbean descent who populated East Harlem. Nuestra gran colonia hispana de Harlem ha de ser desde luego el campo que recibirá, la está recibiendo ya, la especial atención del nuevo vocero. Tendrán el 250,000 de puertorriqueños, los cientos de miles de cubanos, de mexicanos, de peruanos, de americanos en general, unas columnas fuertes como de templo donde leer su información, a donde puedan ser llevados y defendidos por espíritu de justicia, sin posible asomo mercenario. So while spotlighting the diverse pan-ethnic Latino community, this statement is striking for how it seamlessly appropriates the militant idioms of defense, justice, the fight against quote-unquote mercenaries, the very political language of the Spanish Civil War, and projects it onto the Colonia Hispana. And indeed, such application of an anti-fascist Spanish political language to the Hispanic barrios would come to permeate La Voz's local news coverage. For example, when unionized Hispanic workers participated in local strikes, they reviled those who crossed the picket line as quote-unquote moros hispanos, right? A clear reference to the North African mercenaries fighting along Franco's nationalist troops. Similarly, when Puerto Ricans were trying to decry racist representations in the media, they decry the need to create a quote-unquote Frente Unido, a united front, right? So we see this appropriation of the Spanish anti-fascist militant language to understand, right, and mobilize, right, for their own conditions in New York. the militant language of Republican Spain gave expression to the struggles and aspirations of so many in La Gran Colonia Hispana. The way that various national and political local causes of deep importance to the city's Spanish speakers found in New York a voice or expression around the Spanish Civil War is pointedly captured literally as an outcry in an article titled Brillante Acto de Solidaridad, published in La Voz. And this event was an event in solidarity for Puerto Rican independence. It was an act of solidarity with Puerto Rican nationalists. It was led by La Voz's editor, Gilberto Concepcion de Gracia, which became one of the most towering 20th century political figures of Puerto Rico and a key independence fighter, leader of the independence movement in Puerto Rico. And as he's giving, Gilberto Concepcion de Gracia is giving a speech, and as he's finishing his speech, he declares, Latin Americans stand in solidarity with Puerto Ricans. And someone in the audience screams, and the Spaniards. And the way that the article is reported is unclear whether it's that the Spaniards are also standing in solidarity with Puerto Ricans, or Latin Americans are also standing in solidarity with Spaniards. But to me, that was really kind of precisely the point, this ambiguous commingling of solidarities, right? Hints at the ways that the Spanish Civil War serve as a kind of convergence point, right? For so many groups to come together and express their own aspirations for progress. That the solidarities expressed in New York City were multi-directional. Upon hearing this, right, apparently the audience exploded in this in shouts and screams, a spontaneous and passionate outburst that underlined both the omnipresence of the Spanish cause, right, even at an event that had nothing to do ostensibly with Spain, and how it deeply resonated and amplified other freedom causes of great pertinence to Latinos. Such brilliant acts of solidarity transcended a given national cause, conveying instead connection, commonality, continuity in the political visions and aspirations from Harlem to Spain. These kind of unifying political solidarities were reinforced by the affiliating anti-fascist language. And I just want to briefly mention that, you know, this language is sort of omnipresent, this language of unity, from editorials with titles por la unidad, regular columns that were called La Unidad, Festival de la Unidad. You know, this language of unity was everywhere, again, inciting Spanish-speaking New Yorkers of diverse nationalities to identify and act as part of a united Hispanic minority in New York. This unity, again, was really crucial because although the war's front was in Spain, New York Hispanic communities function as a quote-unquote retaguardia. And constantly there are all these articles, there are all these letters where they're emphasizing that although, you know, that Spain is the front, but New Yorkers, Spanish-speaking New Yorkers, are serving as a retaguardia, and that they're also combatants, that they're also fighting. To quote just one letter, the New York Chileans Workers Club president Ernesto Silva wrote a letter from Spain declaring, quote, todos los españoles envían sus saludos a los combatientes de acá. Allá se sabe muy bien sobre sus esfuerzos en la marcha de la liberación española, right? Another article describes them, the Spaniards in Spain and the Spanish-speaking community in New York kind of fighting hombro a hombro, shoulder to shoulder, right? Side by side, creating a kind of front or wall. So this vision of unity, of an emboldened rear guard, was collectively marshaled under the identitary term Hispano. And this is something that's really striking to me, because one thing you see in La Voz is, again, marshaling the usage of this term Hispano in very panethnic terms. And by this, I mean, when articles were referring to someone from Chile or Argentina or Puerto Rico or Cuba that resided in Latin America and their homeland, they would use the national term, right? So we're talking about a Cuban or a Puerto Rican, but when they were talking about a Spanish speaker, regardless of where they came from, who resided in New York or in the United States, in fact, as a whole, they would use the term Hispano first and foremost, right? So there's really a kind of articulation of a pan-ethnic, a rooted, permanent sort of sense of identity kind of being crystallized in the context of the activism for the Spanish Civil War. La Voz's rich visual culture, which featured political and social cartoons that frequently depicted the events of the Latino barrio, with visual cues drawn from the Spanish anti-fascist cause, reinforced this affiliating rhetorical strategies. And by this I mean, so we have the language part, right, creating crystallizing, articulating the sense of unity, but also there was a whole visual culture emphasizing this. And if, in fact, I would, the stunning a portrait that serves as the cover for Dr. Lambe's book, right, is also part of this imaginary affiliating visual imaginary. I want to really briefly, in closing, mention the striking cartoon series titled Estampas De Harlem by the Puerto Rican cartoonist Valdez Cadilla, which cleverly satirized the daily lives of Hispanos against a broader tapestry of the multi-ethnic metropolis. And I mean, they're absolutely remarkable. You see Hispanos, right, and they're always called Hispanos, shopping in the market, walking in the streets, enjoying the theater, dancing, eating, working, being part of the WPA. They really just capture a life in Spanish Harlem, right? In this nascent or budding Latino community. Perhaps one of my favorite is this one titled Estampa de el Subway, which is set in an East Harlem subway line in which 3 commuting New Yorkers read the newspaper. In this estampa to the far left, right, you see the Italian, a man with a distinctive mustache, beret, lunchbox, and patched trousers, who reads the fascist Italian paper Il Popolo, right, in which the words Mussolini and España are visible. To the far right, on the contrary, sits an Orthodox Jewish man with a distinctive hat and long beard who reads a Yiddish paper, The Jewish Morning, announcing, as we see below, the latest decree of Hitler against Jews. Lastly, between these 2 men in the most prominent middle seat sits a woman reading La Voz. She's described in the caption as, quote, una latina, de acuerdo con la confusa nomenclatura racial que nos hemos acostumbrado a usar, por lo que puede ser cubana, puertorriqueña, mexicana, venezolana, de cualquier país hispanoamericano, right? So this Latina that reads La Voz is not a foreigner or an outsider. She's very much part of this kind of social tableau of a multi-ethnic metropolis. Indeed, to me, the image and the caption communicate a clear understanding of Latinidad as a racialized and racializing US-based moniker, which was also which was an integral part of the multi-ethnic and multilingual modern metropolis. The production of images like this and their circulation in venues like La Voz, all of which had the cause of Spain as its raison d'etre, right, as reason for existing, didn't just represent a community, but was part of a larger and multi-front message calling or voicing a pan-ethnic Hispanic community into being, really the forging of Latino New York. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So for our third and final presentation, we have Dr.Montse Feo.
Hola a todos, welcome everybody. Thank you very much, Dr. Lambe, for my invitation, and also Dr. Vials for moderating us and my co-panelists. I'm very excited to see you all here. I'm gonna share some links in the chat so that you can explore them in your computer if you feel like it. Also, I pre-recorded my presentation today. I'm working on issues of accessibility, and also I wanted to make sure I was not going over the time. So let me share my screen and I can show you that. If you cannot hear it, let me know, okay? Bienvenidos and welcome to my talk. From the United States, there were several organized efforts to fight fascism in Spain. Possibly the best well-known is the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. Another significant US-based effort was the Sociedades Hispanas Confederadas, which are making visible through recovery and publications. Among the thousands of Spanish workers who arrived in the United States around the turn of the 20th century, many brought radical traditions rooted in their homeland. They created cultural and mutual aid societies, fueled anti-authoritarian and emancipatory practices, and created culture from below. Only 8 days after the military uprising, these cultural, mutual aid, and radical societies came together in what became known as the Confederadas, with the goal of denouncing fascism and building support for its victims. I'm going to now read page 3 of my book, Fighting Fascist Spain. On July 18, 1936, the same day of the military revolt, Jesus Arenas, a Galician immigrant who would become one of the Confederadas' founding members, stepped off the steam ship Oriente and onto the docks of New York. Arenas was already active in anarchist politics in Spain, and he was traveling to the United States to escape the increasingly dangerous political climate for radicals there. When he arrived in New York that day, in July, the anarchist sojourner found the political atmosphere tense among workers' organizations in New York as a result of the news of the coup. Soon after arriving, Arenas attended an anti-fascist meeting in Union Square, where anarchist José Patín and communist Daniel Alonso, two active members of radical communities in New York, addressed dozens of Spanish workers about the importance of fighting against fascism. During the rally, Arenas joined Patín and Alonso to create the Comité Antifascista Español, and the members of the Ateneo Hispano, a migrant labor activist organization, offered its headquarters in New York as a base. Founded by Arenas, Patín, Alonso, along with several other active members in the Ateneo at the time, the Comité Antifascista Español was the predecessor of the Sociedades Hispanas Confederadas. Although the Confederadas grew to 65,000 members at its height, it maintained close ties with these early established workers' networks. It followed the principles of two specific unions, the Spanish Anarchist Union, or CNT, and the Spanish Socialist Union, or UGT. However, personal experiences and interests connected local and international networks in which ethnic, labor, progressive, and intellectual anti-fascist effort cooperated. Although this cooperation in thought and action did not alter its bottom-up organization approach. Periodicals operated as connecting hubs for workers' networks in the United States and were effective resources to contest elitism while fostering grassroots solidarity and mutual aid. Through the publication of Frente Popular and España Libre, the Confederadas remained devoted to its anti-fascist.
Oops, I muted myself.
It was the
Hello?
longest anti-fascist bilingual.
Oh my God. Can you hear me?
Despite
Oh,
the
excuse me. Somebody just needs to mute themselves. Okay, thanks.
alternative press, workers' periodicals constituted a reliable source of news, opinions, ideas, and practices. Early on, they wrote about the fundamentals of fascist Spain. They denounced the Falange, the cult to the caudillo, national Catholicism, the fascist violence and military power that terrorized the population, and the fascist culture that engaged the population into fear of the left, minorities, as well as the fascist rhetoric of social cleansing, perfection, and power. The Confederadas also fought for workers' civil and labor rights. These principles were expressed through journalism and political essays. The anti-fascist print culture cannot be understood on political terms alone, but rather in the transformative role that culture had in the forms of cartoons, satirical chronicles, literature, and theater. In this regard, periodicals help workers feel part of a broader exiled community which energized their culture and politics. Sailors helped editor González Malo establish a clandestine correspondence with the underground resistance in Spain. España Libre was able to report on the political repression under the regime, news that also reached Spain by the same clandestine channels. At the time when the international press showed scant interest in reporting the civil rights infringements in Spain. The Confederates raised funds to provide financial and legal assistance to refugees, as well as political prisoners and the underground resistance. Women members led these efforts with street protests and fundraisers. In most cases, it was a collaboration that involved several organizations. Refugees often escaped Spain as stowaways in ships or enroll as sailors and would desert on arrival in the United States. The Confederadas provided legal support to prevent deportations back to Spain and paid for their passengers to travel to visa-granting countries in Latin America. The Confederada Secretary, Carmen Cordellat, assisted refugees with legal paperwork and funds. Women also made possible the anti-fascist state that never ceased to raise funds to support victims while galvanizing the exiled community with popular dramaturgic genres. Grassroots groups have placed significant emphasis on preserving and memorializing their own history. From its earlier days, they have preserved their collective memories in periodicals and through educational and the cultural practices of their organizations. Despite these efforts, their records have been destroyed, censored, deemed irrelevant or unworthy of institutional care or research attention. Consequently, much anti-fascist culture has been lost, and the remaining one is not always widely available or accessible. The mission of my digital project, Fighting Fascist Spain, the exhibits, is one of historical justice. I am curating and making these primary sources available in this digital humanities project hosted at US Latino Digital Humanities at the Recovery Project. Two cartoonist exhibits, Huerta a Huerta and Aragones, who became a famous cartoonist, exemplify the Confederadas' culture and demographics. The Francisco Huerta exhibit curates 7 drawings published in Frente Popular in 1938 and a reprint from Bombas de Mano in España Libre in 1943. Huerta, a member of the Ateneo Hispano of Nueva York, published this announcement to donate iron to the Republican zone. His gendered approach was common in the drawings of the war at the time. Women are depicted as nurturing and to be protected by militiamen. Creative expression was one of the most revolutionary means of fighting fascism because it enlarged members' comprehension of the reality and the significance of resistance. The Sergio Aragonés exhibit curates 51 cartoons published in España Libre in the 1960s. The exhibit is organized by his mockery of fascist Spain, the international relations of Franco, as well as his cartoons supporting workers. His art shows that anti-fascist humor shifts from a rhetoric of a strong masculinity to a rhetoric of playfulness about the possibilities of social change. His 1966 cartoon shows how the Spanish fascist identity was inseparable from the imperial one, not only in Latin America, but also in the United States. Franco agents spent funds in promoting a fascist and imperial Spain. Elegant and compassionate, art reversed the dehumanization of fascism and sought to inspire ideas of interdependence and shared struggles among anti-fascist workers in the United States. Aragonés' 1964 cartoon is an example of this. To exiles abroad and the underground readers in Spain, the cartoon conceptualized revolution. Aragonés' visual wit transforms subjection into rebellion. The subjection of a population requires constant surveillance, and the cartoon claims that the resistance is ready for that moment when that surveillance will fail. Most importantly, the infant in the cartoon signifies the new generation of freedom fighters. The protagonist has lost the iconic 1930s masculinity and menacing anti-fascist fist. In 1964, revolution is nonviolent, rather joyous and almost imperceptible in its action, symbolized by the tiptoeing of the child. The nurturing aspects of the new revolutionary movement are emphasized by the warmth of the baby's blanket, which invokes the solidarity necessary for social change. Therefore, the cartoon visually translates the belief in a new free world in which public opinion freely expresses affective solidarity and interrogates power and authority. Central tenets of the anti-fascist culture in which Aragones grew up. He transferred this tongue-in-cheek critical take on the fascists to the representation of American life in Mad Magazine by mocking totalitarian tendencies in democratic societies. Periodical research diversifies anti-fascist studies by including workers until now often erased from the historical discourse. US Latinx periodicals demonstrate that fascism continued in Spain after 1945, and the US and Spanish workers fought it until the democratic elections were held again in 1977. The labor, artistical, educational, and intellectual practices fighting fascism first developed in earlier workers' association and could be maintained by the Confederates through its existence. It moved from the radical politics marked by the Spanish Revolution to collective action based on inclusive print culture and solidarity in multi-ethnic and transnational networks of action. It adapted in exile and created a diverse body of cultural work that also represented a post-war ethnic identity in the United States. Graphic art, published in the periodicals, exposed the state of terror perpetrated by European fascist powers and perceptibly counteracted their propaganda as visual discourse spaces. Cartoons endorse emotions brought forth by belonging to a transnational community and ask readers to think collectively about the need for solidarity and the protection of the working class culture and the attack by fascism. Trajectories of Confederates members show their evolution in the United States. For example, the anti-fascist culture that welcomed Aragones in New York left a lasting impression on him, and his art continues to foreground joy and inquisitive thinking. Malleable and persistent, the Confederates was the workers' political and cultural backbone of anti-fascism in the United States, and its legacy continues today.
All right, can you everyone briefly unmute themselves for a collective round of applause for our three fantastic panelists? All right, so yeah, hopefully, with any luck, in the coming months, we could start doing these kind of things in person again, where you could actually see people's applause and expressions. But I wanted to, I'll start out with one question. I want to leave the audience plenty of time for, Q&A. So I'm not going to do a lengthy kind of, synopsis of all these, but I will ask something that came up multiple times in the presentations, particularly Cristina and Ariel's, but also implicitly in Montse's, which is Cristina had written, or part of her presentation had said, for Latinos of diverse national origins in New York City, the Spanish Civil War and specifically the plight of a republic in Spain was not a foreign, faraway event, but rather a conflict that had direct repercussions for their own local and national yearnings for justice and equality. The battle in Spain was a proxy for their own fight for democracy and freedom. So I wanted to pick up on this notion that the struggle in Spain was a proxy fight for other kind of diasporic Latin American struggles. And that came up explicitly also in Ariel's presentation. She used the word stand-in. Spain was a stand-in for kind of frustrated struggles in Cuba. And so I guess I wanted to ask on that note, since these folks that you're looking at are really kind of operating under the guise and the banner of anti-fascism, did the individuals you look at tend to, you know, like, did they also, when they fought kind of against kind of authoritarianism, colonialism, and capitalism in Latin America, or the Americas more broadly, when they fought against all those three things, did they do so under the kind of guise of anti-fascism? So in other words, did they articulate the struggles in Cuba, in the United States, in various spots in Latin America, Puerto Rico, et cetera? Did they articulate those struggles in anti-fascist terms and in like a pretty much a parallel grammar to Spain, or was there something else at play for them? And feel free, anybody could jump in.
Sure, I'll start out. I'm sure everyone has a lot to say on that. It's really central, I think. I want to start by saying that yes, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to speak to Cubans specifically, since that's my expertise. It's not to say that Cubans did not have a sophisticated understanding of what was going on in Spain in reality, right? So it's not like there's some sort of delusion that they think that they're fighting Batista on Spanish soil. They know exactly what's going on in Spain, and they have a much better understanding of it actually than many US Americans who are similarly identifying as anti-fascist. So with that big caveat, I argue in my book that indeed, like Dr. Odio Pérez says, we couldn't do much in Cuba or in USA. And that kind of sentiment really gets bantered about quite a bit by the Cubans. They felt frustrated, and this specifically was rooted in a major general strike that took place in March of 1935 that was crushed by Batista, who at that point was an ascendant strongman figure. The general strike gets crushed, and many people are demoralized, disillusioned, in exile, in quiescence, in, you know, there's a definite period of difficulty there. And what I have pulled apart in my research is the ways in which they start to use Franco once the Spanish Civil War begins. Here's an ascendant military strongman in a country which just a few decades before was their country, right? Was you know, because Cuba's anti-colonial struggle is very recent, unlike some of the other many of the other countries of Latin America. They start to use Franco as a stand-in for Batista. And the ones who do it most explicitly are the anarchists. The anarchists say Batista is a fascist, but many other anti-fascists, for reasons of censorship, for reasons of fear, they don't say it outright. They don't say our strongman is a fascist, but they say a whole lot of things about Franco that are very clearly also, at least, or more exclusively about Batista. So that when I say the sort of stand-in idea, that's what I'm talking about.
Thank you.
And I guess I'll just add that, yeah, I also agree. I have found that the language of fascism was employed, kind of appropriated, projected onto, you know, these distinct yearnings for racial freedom, for national freedom. Fascism, as I see it circulating in Latinx communities in the 1930s, was this very capacious term. It's emphasized, you know, people talk about fascism in relationship to lynching, right? And in relationship to segregation, in relationship to, in relationship to questions of race, right? Obviously in questions of US imperialism in the Caribbean, and Puerto Ricans' battle for independence. So what's interesting to me is I think the idea of fascism became very capacious, very broad, and became kind of an umbrella term under which all these different imaginaries and frankly political affiliations, you had anarchists, you had communists, you had liberals, right, all coming together and using this language in kind of malleable and imprecise ways to articulate, right, some demands for social change. So I've definitely found that. I guess for me, what's interesting, I'm thinking also more specifically in terms of the Puerto Rican context, to parallel a little bit Ariel's commentary on Cuba, is thinking, you know, Puerto Rican's independence struggle has been thought of and studied in really nationalist, almost insular, you know, terms. And what's interesting to me is to think, how may we think different about Puerto Rican's independence struggles and Puerto Rican leftist history when we think about that history from the vantage point of New York, looking back onto the island. And, you know, I take the example of Gilberto Concepcion de Gracia, someone I always knew as a Puerto Rican independence, pro-independence leader, very much island-based. And it was a huge surprise to me to find him as editor of a pro-Republican Spain newspaper in New York. How that obviously had a huge impact in terms of his ideological outlook, right, and his future career as an independence political leader. So what interests me is again thinking how we may have been a bit blind, thinking specifically in the post-1960s, understanding very ethnic nationalist focused movements of independence, to recognizing and reckoning with the ideological diversity and the multiplicity of political contexts that served as groundwork or seed for so many of these liberation political imaginaries, specifically in the 1960s and 70s. And again, where fascism, from this capacious term that gets kind of filtered through Spain, is key and central. And one more thing, I think it's important to understand that something that's really evident to me from the materials I work is that there was a real understanding that fascism was not restricted to Spain, right? And this is something, a truth we already know, but that like Spain was a sort of front of fascism, but fascism was a threat everywhere, which as we know ended up being true with World War II, et cetera. And these were sort of discourses that circulated very broadly. So again, you know, fascism sort of was like most clearly distilled or was at its crux in Spain, but it was a threat worldwide, right? And they very much saw it that way.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I will only add, I mean, I agree with everything my co-panelists have said. The only thing I would add is that we tend to think about this anti-fascism unions, like starting with the war, but it's before that, because we have to think like Castilla Morales, that was one of the editors of España Libre. He escaped because of the Primo de Rivera dictatorship. Back then, they were already talking about this proto-fascism of Spain. So they were escaping Spain not only during Franco, but during the Primo de Rivera, because they were already seeing this glorification of fascism. So they were seeing this growing interest in fascism in Spain. So if we go to periodicals before España Libre, especially anarchist periodicals here in the United States, we find these comments. So it goes back to what I'm working on right now.
Okay, well,
yeah, I just want to jump on that too, to say that's absolutely true in the Cuban case as well. Cubans are concerning themselves with Italian fascism in the 1920s, that the and indeed famously Machado, who is the strongman leader of Cuba, who predates Batista, is dubbed the tropical Mussolini in that era. So this is absolutely something that begins with, you know, big F fascism of the Italians before Spain, you know, even before Spain is the main conversation, and then and in Spain, in the case of Spain, before Franco is the main conversation. So this is something that develops over that period as well.
All right, well, thank you. So I want to open up, we have plenty of time for questions still. So if somebody would like to ask a question, if you could please either just type stack into the chat menu, or basically, or you could type your question too into the chat window as well. So it looks like we have Rafael.
Yes, hello, and thank you for this great presentation. I am Dominican American myself. I know the Dominican Republic was independent before Cuba, so we don't have a presence in the United States that early. But my question is, what is the relationship between left-leaning Latin Americans and the greater socialist movement in the United States, like the Socialist Party of America?
Anybody could jump on.
I'm going to, thanks for your question, Rafael. It's really fascinating. I'm going to reply with a swerve. I actually haven't studied the the Socialist Party in depth, so I'm not sure. I will tell you there was a sizable Dominican community in the 1930s in New York and 1920s. So I think that's important to recognize. It's sort of render invisible, but there were Dominicans there, and it's again tangential to your question, but I do think it's fascinating. In La Voz, there was extensive coverage of Trujillo's dictatorship. Again, using the language of fascism and using the language of the Spanish Civil War to critique, to mobilize, to rally against Trujillo's regime in the Dominican Republic. And La Voz, I'm finishing an article, I'm working on an article on this. La Voz has extensive coverage, was one of the first newspapers I found to decry and talk about the assassination, the genocide of Haitians at the border in 1937. So that was being covered in La Voz, right? Again, a paper that ostensibly centered on the Spanish Republican cause. And there was broad critique, right? And a very articulate critique, a very clear, concise critique against Trujillo and the Trujillo regime by Dominicans, both in the DR that were serving as correspondents and sending pieces of writing to be published in La Voz, and by also the Dominican American community in New York. So I thought you would find that interesting. It's not directly related to the Socialist Party, but there was a Dominican left-leaning community that was part of this milieu in New York, and whose work, right, and activism is documented in a lot of the culture that I study.
Yeah, definitely. These grassroots groups reach out to parties, reach out to unions, reach out to congressmen. They reach out to anyone who would listen. So yes, the Confederates reach out to the Socialist Party, and actually they helped a lot bringing attention to what was going on in Spain, especially the trials. They send people to watch the trials. They also, for example, help monetarily because a periodical is expensive to print. So sometimes they help on that front. Also, Largo Caballero was going to go deported from France to Spain, and Norman Thomas was able to stop that so that he would have died in Spain. So there was a lot of I mean, he spent all his life in campus in Alemania, in Germany, but at least, you know, there was some movement from here, the United States, helping on that. Another thing that we want to understand is that, for example, Galíndez, that was one of the contributors of España Libre, he was exiled in La República Dominicana, right? And then he came to New York, right, through the Confederates, and he wrote his dissertation against the Trujillo, and that's for that he was assassinated, right? So we have all these things, and sometimes we tend to think that in this, identity politics, but we have to think that these are people that are married to, people that work in the same factory, people that go to the same Athenaeum to spend the Saturdays. So it's a working class culture, community culture that is linked through periodicals. So obviously there is this affective national because of culture, because the food, the classics, the music, but there is a lot of working class connections in the sense of not how we see working class today, but in the working class in the sense of building up industries, building up, and the fascist regimes, the military regimes is always seen in these marxist, but also anarchist perception of power control, whether anarchy, socialist is this, especially anarchists, this idea of collaboration, mutual aid, that everybody brings their strengths, this idea of mutual respect, of accessibility. That's why I'm trying to, in my work as researcher, learn from what we used to call subjects of research. And there is a lot of lessons that they teach me. So I started to trying to speak slower, trying to pronounce. So it's all this self-conscious reflections and help that when people are in power, they lose. So it's all this culture, vibrant culture that they live in their work, they live in their spaces of freedom, of fun, they live in their families. And this idea of I'm Spanish, I'm Puerto Rican, yes, of course it remains, but also it's common. So it's not because, oh, this is imperialism, this is Spain. It's we are together working really hard. These people, we have to remember, some of the editors of these periodicals, we know they slept very little to be able to do this advocacy. So they have common visions of what a radical democracy is.
Okay, great. So we got a lot of questions on the stack, so I want to keep moving on here. So Luisa.
Hi, thank you, everyone. I'm currently working in the first Latino gallery with the Smithsonian. And one of the questions that we have is like, when do we talk about a Latino or Hispanic identity? And Dr. Cristina was saying that prior to the 60s and 70s, when we really talk about this, the civil rights movement, to look at this earlier period to see that. So I was wondering, like, in this anti-fascist movement, how would you understand the development, or do you see the development of a Hispanic identity? Do you see different Latin American groups relating to each other in the United States? And the second part of my question was related to Spain specifically, because in late 19th century, what we see in Latin America is this Hispanism, right? This return to Hispanic values. So unlike previous period was like nothing with Spain. So how do you see that impacting the relationship of Latino groups with Spain, with democracy, taking into account that it's like, is it like a return to the motherland, to relations with the motherland, or something like that? Thank you.
So I'm going to hop in on the second part of your question. I think Christina's probably primed to answer the first part of your question, but because I only study Cuban, so I'm not going to speak to nomenclature around groups as much. But on the second point, for the Cuban case at least, there's a very intentional reckoning with Hispanism. Right? There's a very intentional way in which they know they have to deal with that, if for no other reason than the nationalists in Spain are using it, right? So they have to talk about their support for the Spanish Republic in terms that they're a little bit on the defensive, right? They're trying to claim a different kind of Hispanic identity than the nationalists are pushing. And so in the Cuban case, what they do, because they were already used to talking about an old Cuba and a new Cuba. So what they essentially, and what that meant was like a colonial or neo-colonial Cuba that had to do with authoritarian or strongman governance versus a free Cuba, a new Cuba that would have social justice and racial justice and freedom and so forth, right? For some of them, they wanted democracy, for others, they wanted revolution, but they all grouped in this idea of a new Cuba. And so what they do is they basically take that rhetoric and they apply it to Spain. So they talk about an old Spain, which is the Spain of colonization, the Spain of the church, the Spain of tradition, the exact Spain that Franco is trying to promote. And then they talk about a new Spain, which is the Republic, and that's what they're fighting for. So they claim their Hispanic identity as they claim their Cuban identity in an idea of newness, of progress, of freedom, they're very self-conscious about it. They pull all sorts of examples like Don Quixote and all these historical, references to what they want to salvage basically of Hispanic culture without it being apologist for the empire, without it being sort of nostalgic for, a great imperial past, if that makes sense.
I think that was absolutely, I 100% agree, and it's just really brilliantly expressed, and I 100% agree. For the first part of the question, that's basically the main argument of my book, that, there was a awareness, right, a crystallization, a kind of consolidation of a pan-ethnic, a Latinx, Hispanic identity, prior to the 1960s and 70s. And again, that it was the result of this particular sociopolitical conjuncture. And, to me, the kind of seed of me investigating this question actually harks back to this novel that I co-edited, Manhattan Tropics, published in 1951, and the process of working with a translator and the translation, and the word Latino and Hispanic, appears. And we had to reckon, how do we translate? What does it mean, right? It really forced me to reckon, okay, what does it mean in a text written in 1947? What does it mean to talk about el barrio latino, right? O soy hispano, or los hispanos estamos en todas partes. What does that mean? And it was in the process that served as a kind of seed almost 13 years ago. I can't remember when I started working, reading this novel and thinking about the process of translation, where I had to investigate, what do these terms mean? And I do think that there was a kind of crystallization, at least in the context of New York, of an identity in pan-ethnic terms. And in my book, I look at different instances of my first chapter looks at the role of workers and worker unions, and specifically International Workers Order, and this identity of we are all Hispanic workers, right? So this identity of Latinos and workers coming together. And then, you've seen a little bit of what I think about in terms of anti-fascism, the Spanish Civil War. So I do think it's interesting to give broader history and a broader context to our understanding of the Latinx experience today.
Okay, thank you. So we got a question from William Booth to Dr. Lambe particularly. I was intrigued to see Langston Hughes crop up. Was his solidarity, in your view, expressed through his conception of race, that is the whiter brown man's country, or through his socialism?
Yes. Both, I think, very importantly, and the same is true for Guillén of Cuba. They are very much concerned with the project of racial justice and what we would today call racial justice and anti-racism. They're very concerned with those kinds of projects and impulses, but they are also leftists, and that's absolutely playing into the way that they're looking at all of this and the way that they're looking at each other, Guillén and Hughes. I think, I'm sorry if that's not a satisfying answer, but I really don't think you can choose one or the other. I really think it's both.
Okay, so I had a question from Niall.
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much for this panel. It's been fascinating, and I've got so many questions I could ask. I'd like to ask about with Basilio Queri, who became a member of the U.S. Communist Party. I wondered to what extent did the Cuban Communist Party survive sort of autonomously in the exile, or how common was it? How frequent was it for the exiled Cuban communists to become members of the U.S. Communist Party? I wonder what the relationships between the two communist parties there, and then a question about this idea of the Hispanic unity with La Voz, which I found really interesting. Because I suppose the anti-fascist unity, it's working in all the Spanish world. I mean, I think in like the Costa Rican magazine Repertorio Americano, where you got anti-fascists from all over the Latin American world. You got Waldo Frank, and you got US writers there too. But I wondered, so you got the Hispanic, the search for Hispanic unity. You got the search for an ideological unity in anti-fascism. To what extent does La Voz, or does that anti-fascist community in New York, in the Hispanic community, to what extent does it suffer the problems of the Republican anti-fascist unity with the anarchists and with the poem, etc.? And again, thank you very much.
So again, I'll answer your first question very briefly, and that is to say that I think your question imagines a very fascinating, if relatively discrete, quantitative history project, which is to trace all of the Communist Party memberships of the Cubans who are in the US and see who remains a member of the Cuban Communist Party, who becomes a member of the US Communist Party in the US, who switches. I mean, I think that would be really interesting to use those data that exist to some extent, of course. The communists were pretty good at keeping records, so we do have some record of that. It would take visits to a few different archives and doing a tally, basically, which I have not done. But I will say that Ford, the African-American communist leader, was basically, as far as I can tell, put in charge of the Cubans by the CPUSA. He was their liaison. So he was recruiting Cubans, he was helping Cubans get to Spain, he was very friendly with the Cuban communist officials. There is, in my book, I describe the travel of the volunteer recruiter for the International Brigades, the Cuban communist volunteer recruiter. He does a trip where he goes to New York for a time and communes with communists there, and then goes to Paris and then on to Spain. So there's a ton of connection, but the specific question about numbers that you have, I don't have an answer for at this point.
So question also from Fiona.
Could I quickly answer the question?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Very quickly, just to add about the Hispanic identity. I put some links to my project, but you'll see that this is linked to the recovery project at the University of Houston, where Cristina published her translation. They have been recovering all this identity for years and years, I think 30 now. So you will see that it's not only with the raising of fascism, but before. So you see that in the 19th century. So there are, of course, a lot of differences, but also this idea that they were US Latinos, US Hispanics. So there was a lot of that identity. And about the conflict, that's why the periodical España Libre changed the name. It was called Frente Popular, but the communist members, because this was organized by Ateneos, by organizations. It was assemblyary. So as long as they contributed by doing fundraisings, they had voting, executive voting. And the problem that emerged is that the communist members wanted to spend more money on propaganda for the party and less for solidarity. So they were basically kicked out, and the periodical went from Frente Popular to España Libre.
I'll just add, kind of in between, actually. I wanted to pick up what Ariel said. It's very similar to what I found in terms of the overlaps of communists in Latin America and the Spanish Caribbean and in New York. At one point, the Caribbean headquarters of the Communist Party, or this like kind of umbrella communist organization for the Caribbean, was headquartered in New York. So really, New York was a point of confluence, and there's a lot of overlaps. The leader of the Puerto Rican Communist Party came to New York and actually met his wife, an American from the South, a Southern woman, amazing woman, sort of obsessed with her. He met her in New York and had training in New York, and then went back to Puerto Rico. So it's really kind of a point of confluence. That said, something I found very difficult to reckon with is the fact, like, labels, and this relates to your second part of the question. Like, there were so many people who would call themselves communists that were not necessarily members of the party, or there's no way if they were ever members of the party or didn't keep up with their dues. There were so many people. I would argue most of the left-leaning community in New York was sympathetic, but may have had some, some may lean more towards anarchism, some may lean more towards communism, may or may not have been members of the party. So the people that were very ideologically rigid, right, and were actually the people that were the directors, right, of these different political organizations. But in terms of the grassroots movement, the kind of quote unquote rank and file, most of these people had much more porous sort of ideological affiliations. And that relates to this question of infighting. And it's something I've dealt, the infighting, you definitely see it there, and you see debates in the newspapers. But I think because, again, and at the top level, certainly there were a lot of divisions and clashes, but at a kind of grassroots mass level of the majority of the community that identify themselves progressive, for example, is another key term. That was kind of an umbrella. We are progressive, progresista, progresivo. And again, you could be progressive anarchist, progressive communist, progressive, so in between, even New Deal liberals, like so many people just, they loved Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a hero, so the kind of divisions and schisms that we tend to see at the hierarchy of the top leadership didn't quite percolate as much to the rank and file, and I think that kind of allowed so many of these ideologically diverse sort of newspapers to the left of the center to kind of exist in this sort of robust a leftist culture to flourish.
Now we got Fiona.
Thank you for the panel. In terms of the references that were made to advocacy or relief for children, as well as mutual aid societies, to what extent is this connected to organizations that originated in country, or is this ferment coming out of the diaspora specifically?
The diasporas brought their own traditions, and they brought the mutual aid traditions and the cultural organizations and the workers' organizations, but it's not something that starts in the 20th century. It was before, in the 19th century too, here in the United States. So it's like when we talk about working class culture, we see some of these authors that were doctors, but maybe they were first generation doctors. So they have lived in a working class culture in their homes. So they brought all these traditions, but they were fostered here in the enclaves because they used to move into the fields, to the mines, to the cigar factories. So it got solidified here in the United States as well. Yeah.
And on the children's campaign in Cuba, I will say that it was very much originated in Cuban organizations and networks. It was, of course, related to and connected to the international aid for Spanish children campaign and organization that was, headquartered in France and was, working in multiple countries. But the Cuban campaign was and the association associated with the campaign were very, very Cuban, and really brought together in the auspices of this quote unquote nonpartisan charity model, which was a crock. It was absolutely partisan, but they were pretending to be a nonpartisan charity. They bring together Freemasons, they bring together very religious people, they bring together lots and lots and lots of working class Cubans on the island and also in the diaspora, who are, eager to help the poor children of Spain. And there's, going back to the Hispanic question, there's a whole rhetoric around how we share blood with these children, and we are their mothers, and when their mothers have been killed, we must become their mothers. And there's a huge familial rhetoric around that campaign as well. But more to your question, yes, it's very much based on the island, in the Cuban diaspora, although it's connected to the international movement to aid Spanish children.
Thank you.
Okay, cool. So I got a question from Ana Maria. It's for Montse specifically. Did the SHC have a lot of problems operating in the 1950s? Was it included in the list of anti-communist organizations like the Joint Anti-Fascist Refugee Committee? And if not, do you think they navigated the operations in a different way?
Yeah, of course, they were very careful not to mention words like, anarchy or communism, because as Cristina said, even though the communists, the hardcore ones, the ones that wanted propaganda were kicked out, there were many others that remained because they were happy with, how they, I call them Confederates because that's how they call themselves instead of SHC. But yeah, they were happy how the Confederates were doing their work. But obviously, you had the FBI reading the periodicals. They didn't understand Spanish sense of humor. So they thought all the time they were communists when they were actually attacking the communists. So the FBI were visiting the headquarters and saying, and it's funny because in the satirical chronicles, they said, I don't know, they got scared. Sorry, my cats got scared. Okay, I think it's because something fell. Okay, sorry about that. So anyway, yeah, my phone fell. That was what it was. The phone. So anyway, so they say, oh, we always know when they come once a week and they are very, exalted, and they'll talk about, capitalism, and we know, oh no, another FBI infiltrating today. We have work to do. So they really knew, and it was very funny, these chronicles. But it was also bad because also, for example, Malo was visited all the time trying to make them sign documents so that he could be deported. We have Fleischman, a Jewish lawyer that worked pro bono for them, helping with all these issues. And obviously there was the Spanish consulate, infiltrating in the Confederadas, in the Puerto Rican, in all these other communities, trying to find who was who so they could report it to the FBI. So there was a lot of espionage going on these events.
Okay, well, it looks like we're at time. Unfortunately, there is a couple more questions in the stack. For Joel, Mary, and Raphael, if you want to send me your questions to me at christopher.vials@uconn.edu, I can forward them to the panelists if they have time to answer them later on. But again, my email is christopher.vials, VIALS@uconn.edu. But so thank you everybody for attending the event, and thank you for our panelists for a wonderful panel, and feel free to unmute yourself for yet another round of applause for our panelists.
Thanks everybody so much for being here. This has been great.
Yeah, it's been wonderful.
Yeah, that was great. I learned a lot from your talk, and